Welcome to the Inspired Conversations podcast, hosted by me, Andrea Cova-Bernal. As a college counselor, I'm inspired not only by the incredible students I work with, but also by remarkable change makers in higher education, each with powerful stories of their own. Through storytelling and shared narratives, I believe in the power of connection. Join me as we delve into dialogue and share valuable advice for college success. Welcome to the Inspired Conversations podcast. If you're just tuning in and joining us for today's conversation, I'm extremely excited and honestly extremely humbled and honored to introduce our guest speaker for today, Professor, as well, Dr. Jaclyn Rodríguez. But before I do that, I want to share a little bit more about our podcast and how it started. A few years ago during COVID, As a college counselor working with underrepresented students, realized that there weren't many opportunities for students to truly share their stories and elevate the incredible things that they're doing in Los Angeles and in many parts of the nation. And as a result of COVID, they also, were impacted so much in the application process. So I started my first podcast called the College Match Podcast, where I was sharing their incredibly powerful stories. And along the way, I started meeting folks in academia and higher education who had just as powerful stories as our students. And I wanted to create a space for those folks to share, to inspire, and to engage in dialogue with me. And speaking of dialogue, I learned everything I know for the most part when it comes to leadership and educational conversations from Dr. Rodríguez today. And so, Dr. Rodríguez, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I am so excited, and I'm well. I was actually kind of sick, but this has just made me feel much better.
Oh, I'm so glad. Well, hopefully this can bring a little bit of joy to your day, as it is to some of our audience members and the folks who'll hear us later. But I definitely can't do justice in introducing you, although I know that you have over 30 years of experience just at Occidental itself, also as an alumni of Oxy. But most importantly, you are, part of the DD&RS committee, which you can explain in a little bit. You can also share a little bit more about the work you did. But can you just give us a quick introduction? Who are you? And tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now. And then we can go into some of the conversation.
I'm Jackie, and I'm a daughter and a granddaughter and a partner and a mom who believes deeply in education. And it's always been part of my trajectory, even when I didn't have the words for it. And so I think that I'm an advocate for diversity. I think I am an advocate, especially for first generation college students. And I'm a fighter around those issues.
Can you share a little bit more? Let's actually take it a step back, because I feel like where we are in education sometimes truly stems from our experience as children and growing up. Can you share a little bit about your history, your background, where you come from?
Yes, I'm from East Los Angeles, and I'm really proud of being from East Los Angeles. I say I'm a Garfield girl, Garfield High. Not everybody is lucky enough to attend Garfield High, but I was. And I went to Belvedere Junior High School and Hamill Street School. And education was always something that my family emphasized, especially the women in my family. So my grandmother, Paula, lived in the house in front of us. So it was kind of also a multi-generational house. And then we lived in the house and back. And she's from Mexico, and she was taken out of the third grade to work in the fields. So for her, education was always really important. And some people will say, especially around that time, that education was really an emphasis for males at most and less females, but not for her. For my mother and my grandmother, there was no question that I was going to go to college. They probably had some ideas about what I would do in college, but I probably had my own. Okay? So that was interesting. My family has always told me, especially my mother, that I'm just like my grandmother, and it made me crazy because my grandmother would always say things like "Solo yo entiendo." And she was tenacious, she was sharp tongued, and she was dark skinned like me. She would make friends with people in the neighborhood as they moved into the neighborhood, invite them to coffee, have pan dulce with them, but also really encourage those who came from El Salvador and from different places in Mexico to learn English. So she hooked them up with English classes. She got them hooked up also with citizenship courses, and she really pushed them to vote. So back then I thought, oh my God, she's such a fisgona. You know, she just in everybody's life. And it really, she was my first political model. And I didn't even think about that until probably 10 years ago. I didn't have the language, I didn't have the lens. And so while it still makes me a little anxious to be compared to her, I absolutely have a lot of overlap. That's all I'll say.
Oh my gosh. Well, talk about not just in your community, but inspirational. And at Garfield, at the time, I think was such a center hub for activism and a lot going on. I know the executive director I work with for College Match is also a Garfield alum, and has since forged a path for the work that I do as well. And so, can you share a little bit about your high school experience and growing up in Los Angeles?
I think high school was great. It was huge. There were probably 3,000 students at Garfield, over 3,000 students at Garfield. And I felt so at home. I loved Garfield High School. I said it was my best educational experience because I was around people like me. I really did feel that I was being seen as a student among a bunch of other things. I wasn't just a Latina, because we were all Latinos for the most part. There was maybe 10% of the population was Japanese American, but that was about it. And at Garfield High School, I really felt that the teachers were extraordinary teachers who believed in the students. I was in the so-called gifted track. That might have been different. I don't know. A sad thing that happened at Garfield was, even though we were all Latinos, we sometimes discriminated against one another.
Yeah.
And so there were the activists, there were the Mexican Americans, and there were the people who just came from Mexico, right? As opposed to really thinking the person across the street sees us as all the same, right? And that we should really be working together. When I started Garfield, the Vietnam War was ending. I didn't know very much about it, but as a Latina, I knew many of my relatives were in the service because that was one of the trajectories that we took. I felt that they were pushing us to take the best courses, geometry, trigonometry. I did drop calculus because I thought it was very boring. I didn't understand it. Probably that was in there, but I took typing instead. And I used to tell my daughters, I use typing every day. I don't think I would have used calculus every day. And that's not a negative thing for calculus. If you can do it, do it.
Right. No, and it sounds like you really sort of created your own path and all of that, but you had the support from your teachers, which is not every day we can even say today. I think a lot of high schoolers feel that they don't see themselves in their teachers. They don't see themselves in their spaces. So then it led you to, can you share a little bit about why you decided to stay close to home for college and what it was about Oxy that made you sort of stay there for so long?
Yes, that's a great question. When I was applying to college, was probably the beginning of affirmative action. And so there was a real push to get underrepresented students, working class students, into colleges, whereas before colleges really had been for people primarily of privilege, right? Legacies. And so at that time, a lot of my friends were applying to Princeton and Yale and Columbia, all of these places back east. I personally did not think I could handle that. And even when I say it right now, I get anxious. So I applied to two local schools, Occidental and USC. And they're very different, but I didn't even think about it in that way. I didn't know what a liberal arts college was. I heard about Occidental in gym. The woman whose locker was next to mine was the top student at Garfield High School, and she had chosen Occidental. So I started to think about that, but I'd not heard about it. USC, of course, we heard about it. My father was incredible fan of football.
Trojans all the way.
So I remember visiting Occidental, and the counselor asked my father, because again, very much parents were involved with their college, their students' decision about where they were going to go to college. So he came on a visit with me, and I still remember the counselor asking him, what does USC have that Occidental doesn't? And he said, Tommy Trojan.
Oh my gosh.
Football. And I mean, that was a really important lesson for me. I laughed at the time because I understood that impact. But on the other hand, that is the way many of us think about college, is athletics and sports, not necessarily the learning. I thought I could do well in a smaller environment. I wanted to stay very close to home. And that's how I decided to come to Occidental. We also got a letter at the time that I loved, a letter from people in Mecha. It was Mecha at that time, not Mecha Alas or the Latinx Club. It's the, with time, names for organizations change appropriately, so to become much more inclusive. But we got letters from individuals that were in Mecha, and they said they were introducing themselves as our sponsor at Occidental College. So I love the idea that somebody was reaching out to me ahead of time who could tell me what was up at Occidental, who I might take, what trajectory I might select, who might be my friends, where can I eat good food, that kind of stuff. And just that very simple action, they stopped it, but that action was critical for making a connection beyond Garfield High School. And the other thing I would say is 6 people also came to Occidental when I came to Occidental. So having a group like that was also really helpful. It was really useful.
I mean, and you just mentioned 2 things that I think are just so significant, because when you were entering college, as you said, affirmative action had just sort of launched and started. And here we are 2 days away from the possible reversal of all of that. We obviously don't know what the decision is going to be, although a lot of us, especially in academia and the higher ed world, sort of know what to expecting something of worse. But what are your thoughts around all of that, and what could potentially happen in a couple of days and a couple of years for the rest of the students applying?
I'm anxious.
Good question.
I am always hopeful, because every now and then the Supreme Court will surprise us. This one has not, but I'm still hopeful that there might be some kind of loophole. I remember the last time the Supreme Court took this up, one of the justices said, I would hope that in 25 years, there would be no need for affirmative action. And I can't even remember what year that was, but clearly they saw it as a temporary fix. I think affirmative action, I think attending to diversity in all of its forms is probably more important now than it's ever been. We have more of a wage gap, and college is expensive. Mm-hmm. You know, I didn't even think when I went to graduate school that I'd need a suitcase and more clothes, different kind of clothing. Yeah. Simple kinds of things like that. Tickets home, phone calls home, to connect with the people you wanted to connect with. Mm-hmm. So I think our country right now seems to really be going back and trying to control the lives and the lived experiences of women, of LGBTQ individuals, of people of color. And there's a lot of fear in a lot of people across the country. So I don't know that I've ever seen it this polarized. So again, I'm hopeful, but I'm not, I won't be surprised. And all of my life, nothing has been given to us. One has always had to fight and to continue to fight. I'm not a sociologist who sometimes will say, well, this is good because conflict is good. I'd rather have a little less conflict. I don't think this is necessarily good, but we have a lot of people that are willing to fight for this. And we see it all over the country right now with respect to some of the other decisions that the Supreme Court has made.
Yeah, no, thank you for that perspective too, because I think in our work, at least in mine, I really work hard to help uplift the voices of our students and encourage them to create, spaces where they feel comfortable and confident and owning. But I just think they're hearing all of these things around them where that voice doesn't matter, right? And it's not as heard. And so it's really conflicting messages to them. So, I pray all goes well, but I think in our world right now, we do have to start thinking creatively of how to, create these spaces for them, and one thing you also mentioned earlier that brought sort of attention to me is over the last 2 weeks, I've been doing college application workshops, all underserved, underrepresented students, first generation, the first in their family to go to college. And what they know in Los Angeles are the UCLAs and USCs of the world. This is what they hear. Believe it or not many of them have heard of Occidental College yet, right? Hopefully with some encouragement. And so it has been really difficult, especially post-COVID, to convince them to leave to learn, to experience things outside of their comfort zone. So when you went to graduate school, where did you go? And how was that experience sort of different than the local?
Yes. Again, affirmative action was essential at that time. And I was a psychology major at Occidental College. And I became a social psychologist, which a lot of people think of psychology as clinical work. You're a therapist. And there are many, many facets of psychology. But I fell in love with social psychology, which is really about the influence of other people on our thoughts, our behaviors, and our feelings. And so things like conformity, believing that everyone else feels this way. Things like love. What really is love? What are issues that are associated with successful relationships? It's also prejudice and discrimination, which really taps into what's happening in our country right now. The beliefs about a stolen election, the beliefs about where the country should be going next. And I fell in love with it. So all I did was look up which schools are good, which are top rated. And there was a document called the Peterson Guide at the time. And they would rank schools. And Michigan and Stanford were number one. And I think I applied to 5 schools, and I wanted to study prejudice and discrimination. I wanted to study attitudes, especially about people of Mexican descent, Latinos in general. And so I applied to Michigan. I applied to be truthful, I applied to Stanford. I didn't get in, but I was very fortunate. I got getting into Michigan because Michigan actually gave more PhDs to people of Mexican descent than anyone in the country at that time. When I got to Michigan, they had just gotten a grant, like a $1 million grant. And that time it was a significant amount of money to conduct a national study on people of Mexican descent. So talk about serendipity. I walk in and this guy who's the head of the project says, welcome, we're glad to have you with us. Here's your desk. So I actually had an office and a desk as soon as I arrived. But what was more important, I think, was I had a community of individuals that were interested in the same thing. And so there were interesting challenges, the Tejanos versus the Californians, right? In terms of experiences and ideas. But it was a wonderful experience. I learned so much. My mentor, Patricia Gurin, extraordinary woman who's white, was on this project. And she actually was the one who ended up being the expert witness to the Supreme Court for affirmative action from the University of Michigan when they were being challenged. And so I was around people who literally had this kind of work in their bones, as they said, not something that was passing through. They'd done for generations. And what I noticed when Pat retired was she invited a number of people to go back to Michigan. And she said, I'd like to first honor my students. And a lot of students, she said, could you please get in the middle of this huge room? I would say 3/4 of us were students of color.
Amazing.
Her commitment was really to students of color. And it wasn't a paternalistic commitment. If Pat passed you, you know you were doing great. And I think she is the one I model as I taught. I remember a student saying, just at DDNRC, a former student of mine said, yeah, she was tough on us. And that toughness really came from a respect for the students. So Michigan was terrific for all of those reasons, but I still wanted to come home. I didn't like the cold.
Right. The small things I think that matter in our lived experiences. One thing that you also, by the way, I still have all of the books that I had in your classes still on my bookshelf because that's how powerful and impactful some of our conversations were. But one experience that I'll always remember when I first got to Oxy, my very first job was in the psychology department, which is where obviously you worked as the front desk, right? As teacher's assistant aide, and where all of the other professors were coming and asking me for print jobs and to make copies of things. And you were the first one to come up to me and ask how you can help me grow and experience and just, I'm here to help you just as much as you're here to help us. And I'll always remember that conversation, as this isn't about the teacher-student perspective, even though you were hard on us, I will say that. They were definitely very hard. It was a very thoughtful experience that I don't think students that go to larger institutions and universities will get every day. But one thing you also brought to Oxy, and I definitely want to jump into the dialogue piece because, and I'll start with this. Last Friday, I had a Socratic seminar with my students. We sat around the table and talked about having gone through all of the ups and downs of figuring out college application pieces. How are they feeling? And we dialogued about the expectations they had, the fears that they had, again, all first generation students. And the conversation was very deep, emotional. And so I say all of that is because I learned sort of the power of dialogue and how in vulnerable moments and opening up in vulnerability, it can bring out truly the best of us. So thanks to you, that all sort of took place and happened. But can you share a little bit about your experience in intergroup dialogue and why bringing it to Oxy was so important?
Yeah, and I want to start by telling you why I brought it to Oxy. It is a very social, psychological model, okay? Bringing people across difference together. So groups is a theme in social psychology. Conformity, attitudes, prejudice, all those are part of potential dialogue dimensions. But I was an associate dean at Occidental for a while, and there are these surveys that they ask students to take. And one question on the survey, and you could isolate Oxy students, ask students, how important is diversity in education, in higher education? And the percentage of Oxy students saying that it was very important was extremely high, 80s or 90%. Another question said, how many conversations do you have with people who are different from you? How many conversations do you have with diverse audiences? And that number was so low. And so the juxtaposition of those two suggested to me that really, if Occidental was going to be true to its mission, to really to create individuals who are interested in democracy, inclusive democracy, that I needed to create some kind of venue that would allow this to happen. I happened to be having lunch with Pat Gurin, and she said, we're going to do this multi-campus study at Michigan. We've got about 8 schools that are going to do this. They're all public. Occidental would be the only small one. You should think about doing this. So I thought, oh my God, that's great. And so I kind of just wiggled my way into that. And Anna Jaclyn, who you mentioned, was a student of mine at Occidental College. She actually was a Caltech student, I think in engineering, and Caltech allows you students to take Oxy courses. So she took a few Oxy courses, ultimately went to Michigan and returned. And it was such a beautiful model of the student becoming the teacher and the teacher becoming the student. She taught me a lot about the curriculum of dialogue and the stages that were involved. And so I benefited from this study from these incredibly generous people who had in their bones an interest in bringing people together across difference, not necessarily to agree, but to build your capacity to open up, to understand the responsibility of hearing the experience of another, of potentially working together. So that's how dialogue started. And as an associate dean, I began with a pilot. That's how it's always really good to begin. I'm going to have a pilot. And I asked, at that time, David Jackyn, who was the dean, could the students earn 2 units of credit for this? Because, see, they're doing all this work, and they want to learn more about how to do this work in an intellectual setting. And so the pilot was extremely successful. We moved from 2 credits to 4 credits. And what I loved best, I think one of the most important marks I left at Occidental was creating the opportunity for students to become educators. Yeah. So the peer education model started with dialogue. Students were paid for it, they earned course credit, and they came together in amazing ways.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned it's not just about vulnerable conversations, but it's about difficult conversations. And, from my experience, I was part of the race dialogue group, and, we were a multitude of different ethnic, cultural identities in multiple ways. And I think to force the conversation is almost, it's a harsh word, but in order to do that is what builds right tolerance and confidence in our voice. A lot of the students who are off to some of these PWIs or predominantly white institutions have yet to create or learn about these spaces, I guess I should say, and understand, I guess, the power and conflict, and difficult conversations. So what would you tell those students who are just starting their college journey, who, don't have these spaces or have never experienced this before? How can they initiate it and feel confident in it?
Well, they can always write me. And you mentioned the DDNRC, the Difficult Dialogue National Resource Center. We do some consulting. We help people create curricula. And we give them the terminology and the intellectual framework. A lot of people think this belongs in student affairs, not for credit that it should be extra. So it's like a club, and it's much more than that. And the best programs also, I think, wed student affairs and academic affairs. So both of those parties are involved. So I would suggest to them to create a proposal and to indicate what the goals of this proposal are, but also to name the successes of these types of programs. So there are several books on the outcomes of intergroup dialogue that came from that study that we conducted, the 9-campus study. And what you find in general, and the study was conducted on race dialogues and on gender dialogues. Mm-hmm. And what you find overwhelmingly is that students build their capacity for tolerance, for anxiety, for naming things, but for listening to other perspectives. The goal is not indoctrination. The goal is not to change somebody's mind, but the goal is to figure out what are the things that I hadn't thought about. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that does change people's minds. What are the things that I might be interested in working with to bring about some social justice on campus? And I remember my first psychology teacher was Dennis Vanderweel, and he was a physiological psychologist. We couldn't have been more different. Mm-hmm. But when I returned to work, after several years, he retired, and I was supposed to speak, and I was so emotional. Mm-hmm. And I remember asking him, "Are you still a Republican?" And he said, "Yes, I am." I said, "You're the one I want to work with," because of his capacity to hear, to be open, to think about things. And I think that's what dialogue does. So I think there is intellectual, empirical information that supports the creation of these dialogues if students would like to begin them on various campuses.
Yeah, and I think it also, though, it really does start with the educator and the teacher in many ways. And I think you don't necessarily, at least this is my thought, you don't necessarily have to be trained, although it's extremely important and powerful to know how to facilitate these types of conversations. But I think the earlier you start, whether it's middle school, high school, anything before that, to engage in difficult conversation, because especially now post-COVID and also in what we're encountering in the conflict in society today, I think this is a skill, a life skill that everyone needs to have. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree completely. I have, I don't know how many people that went through dialogue have gone on to earn their terminal degrees. I have so many PhD former students. I have so many EDDs. I have so many attorneys. And I think what has helped them get into graduate school is their capacity to reflect, to perspective take, and to communicate what it is they're thinking. They have an ability to dance with another individual, and that is an important issue. I think not to be taken aback, but to say, here's why I might agree, and here's why I might not agree. I have had a number of students go on to library science, to speech therapy, to masters in social work. So it's not just that you're going to get one of any specific degree. I think it's your ability to have those conversations and not blow up. Yeah. I think that's critical.
Yeah, you're right. And also not sort of change who you are. That's another thing. I think a lot of times students feel like they've got to assimilate to the environment that they're now sort of being pushed into, as opposed to, like you said, being okay to say no, or I don't agree with that, but here's why, and I think that's, again, all of these skills that you can learn in many ways in elementary level. And is that the type of work and pedagogy you're creating through the network that you're in, or are there folks out there building these types of curricula now?
There are. We do a range of things in DDNRC. And our conference really helped us understand what are people doing now. And I'm an old person. I don't know that I could do a Gen Z dialogue, but the reality of how generational distance or generational experience speaks to dialogue, I think we continue to grow. The thing I love about dialogue is I'm never done. So I really I shouldn't use the word hate. I really did not like the term woke because that suggested an endpoint to me. And I feel there's so much that I continue to need to understand. I love what you said about you're not changing who you are. If anything, you're getting on a path that will allow you to be more comfortable with who you are. Mm-hmm. And so rather than assimilate, because some of our students have gone to these prep schools and fit in there and felt, wait a second, how might that experience have really been, how might it have been for me? Mm-hmm. Was it a positive thing? Was it potentially more negative? Did I lose some of myself? Could those students have conversations with members of my own family who haven't been in school? And so one thing I think also that dialogue does is it gives you skills, it gives you activities. What makes dialogue rich is that we don't just read and talk to one another. There's an exercise that we do with every course that allows us to self-reflect. Mm-hmm. So that self-reflection prepares us to move on. I had a student many years ago who was a multiracial student, and he said, I came to dialogue because I had S word to say to white people. Mm-hmm. And his final paper said, I realized there were many things I had to say to myself first.
Oh my gosh.
So dialogue, I describe as a window and a mirror course. You have a mirror into your own life, but you get a window into other people's lives. And the integrity that is required of any participant in dialogue, I think, opens you up to have the conversations that you're concerned about having with other people. I really love the skills you get from dialogue because I have used those techniques in other courses. And I've always said I became a better teacher when I gave up control of the classroom.
Oh, wow. Yes.
You share and you invite people into the conversation. And I have learned so much from my students, so many of my blind spots. And it's a gift. So for me, I've always said teaching is an act of love. And I believe that dialogue is an act of love. So we try to stand in the space. And it's a really hard time right now. A lot of students of color, for example, do not want to have cross-race dialogues. And I get it. So I think we need to know where people are before we place them in a dialogue. I think it's really wonderful to have intragroup dialogues because we're not all the same. Yeah. And so speaking our truths in that space is beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. Really, and you mentioned this earlier in your personal experience of, intercultural, what am I trying to say? Where even in your community, there was, conflict, and even in your, right, the people around you. And I think that that's important too, because even when we go to these spaces and we see brown faces or we see folks who might come from the same backgrounds, there's still a conversation to be had there about their diverse background and where that can lead. I have a lot of students who are in that boat right now. They go off to these, again, communities thinking they can find their spaces in Mecha Alas or the Latino, student unions of the world, or even the Black student unions, and still find, isolation, let's say.
Exactly. And some of that is adolescence. Yeah. It's us trying to figure out at that age, who are we and what are our values? And the greatest growth actually occurs when students attend college outside of their typical neighborhood. I, of course, did not do that. But I would say that as a predominantly white institution, Occidental was outside of my neighborhood. Even though it was so close, I think about people who lived in Highland Park being very close to Occidental, but two very different worlds.
Yeah, and it still very much is. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So speaking of dialogue, I also, we've got about 5 minutes left, but it is truly important to me. I know these spaces really don't exist in podcast world. It's always just, the interviewer and the guest, and which is why I invited folks today. I do have a question from somebody who signed up and RSVP'd, but I wanted to open it up to any of the audience members. I don't know your name, but if you have any questions, feel free to just jump in, dialogue, open it up. But I will start with this one question that we got from an audience member. What first attracted you to dialogue? And do you have any specific stories of success stories, is what they said, of a student? You kind of mentioned one earlier, which was hit me, and how, his last paper came. But what first attracted you to dialogue? Start there.
Yeah, as a social psychologist and as the first Latina alum that was hired by Occidental College, they'd hired men. Okay. They hadn't hired very many women that were alums. I think I might have still been the first tenure track female to have been hired. Maybe, I don't know. I'm thinking of Ray McCormick because she was hired but wasn't tenure track. I think one of my most amazing stories came from a woman who names herself Miss Queenie, Wanda. And she was in the first dialogue course that I ever taught. And it was a facilitator training course. And she's an incredible, incredible educator. But she went on to get a degree in teaching. And then she went on, she's an African-American woman. I love taking credit for her. She gives me a lot of credit. She came to dialogue as an extraordinary human being. I can't really take credit for her. She was amazing. But she just presented at the DDNRC conference and blew people away. This was like, 20 some years. She's in about 20 days, she'll earn her EDD from USC. But she has created, based on need, she created Black School for Black students. And there they would learn Black culture, Black history. She's worked with stars and athletes that are very famous, I won't name, that are interested in something similar. She has also just recently begun Black School for white people. And it's maybe an 8-unit course and it costs people something. But when I think about a super successful student that is just really continuing to grow and to push people, I think about Queenie.
Yeah.
I can't mention my daughter, but
Why not? Queenie. You can absolutely mention your daughters, who were so lucky to grow up and have this in conversation all the time. That's amazing. In fact, I remember she went to Oxy, right?
One did. One of them went to Oxy.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. And then Andrea. Yeah. So no, absolutely. I think that's really powerful. But you you mentioned that you said it was called the Black School. How can we find out more about that? Is she still in action or just doing USC right now?
Oh, she's still in action. She actually, the degree she's earning is global education. So we're friends on Instagram and we're friends on Facebook. And so I'll look at her and she's in Helsinki, she's in the Middle East, she's doing all this because she really is learning about global educational models. They literally accepted 3 people to this program at USC. And I'm really proud of the work that she's done. Yeah. So, there are many people like that. There are many people that you talk about assimilation. I have so many students of color that never even identified as students of color. Yeah. And then they go through something like dialogue and they can embrace their roots, where they come from, with some pride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I also do have a question from a J-Rod fan club. I'll go ahead and ask it for you. Dr. Rodriguez, they are wondering if there are specific schools that actively promote dialogue. This is a really good question, that actively promote dialogue on their campuses.
Yes, there are. There are some specific schools. I'd have to look up some of the names, and some are credit-based, but I would have to get back to you on that. The University of Michigan has a week-long program, and when we finished our studies, we needed to go and really present this 1 week study on dialogue. And we use dialogic methods to talk about how do you recruit, what's the curriculum, how do you experience, how do you assess, because so many people want dialogue assessed, which kind of bugs me because we don't assess a lot of other programs, academic programs, but dialogue and diversity programs are often assessed. And so I like that space because we teach individuals how to reproduce dialogue, and then we continue to work with them. But I do need to get that. I would be able to get a short list of these schools for you, because I think it's really important. What is happening right now with some of the backlash, say against DEI, it's not just Florida, Texas, a number of places. We had somebody give they did a training in Florida about a month after DeSantis, or whatever his name is, DeSantis, said the DEI was going to be forbidden. And what they were able to do was not allow, we didn't bring in identity names, but the students brought them in. If the students can bring them in, that's another way of going. But a number of schools are really trying to end DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion work.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Please do share that list. I can imagine several counselors probably tuning in to the podcast, hoping for resources. I know I am when I teach my class on how to create your college list and, find your best fits. I'm always looking for these specialized types of programs where I know our students will thrive and grow in. And this 100% being one of them. So thank you so much for that question.
Can I say, and with two things, I know you're about to end.
That's okay, please.
And one is, I'll get emotional. My mother was probably my strongest advocate, Amparo Rodríguez, and she passed away 5 years ago. To this day, when something significant happens, I get the urge to call her. So she is always with me in a different way. But whenever I used to get frustrated or upset, she'd just get my hand and she'd say, look at what Dad and I created, not only in me, but, both of my daughters are educators and they have chosen to teach at predominantly Hispanic institutions. And so I'm very proud of them. And I can't believe it. I can't believe that from really my grandmother and my mother, this kind of emerged. And I would encourage people to really think about this. So those are really the two things I wanted to say, to pay homage to my mother and to keep it going. You asked me for 3 pieces of advice. Trust your gut. I really think that we know what it is we want. So many times, at least in my family, my father wanted me to be a lawyer. He had no idea what psychology was. I told him, this is what I want to study. And then I went on to get a PhD, and it took me many years. And he'd say, when are you going to finish? When are you going to finish? And he asked me, are you going to finish? Okay. And so that was important, trusting your gut. Be your best advocate. So many of us don't understand the skills that we have. I have a couple of chapters that are really powerful. Pedagogies of the home it's called, because people don't understand being able to navigate the system for a parent that might speak Spanish or another language is a skill. Being able to speak Spanish is a skill. And we just look at things as deficits rather than benefits. So advocate for yourself, redefine that. I guess those are my two main ones. Oh, I know, get a mentor.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
You need a mentor.
Thank you. I actually I'm tearing up myself too, because, earlier you said, for your daughters, and you paid homage to your mother and your grandmother. And, their response really was, look at what I created. And I just have to say, I didn't have my family close when I was going to college, and you truly were family for me. And I felt in my space there. But also, look at what you created, Dr. Rodriguez. Look at what you created. And I want you to know that I think from all of the students who experienced your teaching style and what you brought to Oxy are following in those footsteps, truly. And I would say, I say that on behalf of myself, truly. And so thank you so much for that, for your advice, for your time. I hope this isn't the end of the conversation, and I imagine it not being, with so many things coming up in the coming days and updates. But most importantly, for anybody tuning in today, excuse me, I'm tearing up here. For anybody tuning in today, I will also in the credits offer some resources and suggestions. So if there are any places, Dr. Rodriguez, that you feel folks can get involved and support, please pass those on so that we can just spread the word about the impact of dialogue. So thank you for your time today, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you so much. It's been a joy. I'm in a dark space because I always forget that light that you're supposed to have, because I don't teach anymore. I am retired and I love it. So.
And good. And you know what? You have your grandkids and your daughters and your kiddies. You have a life. But outside of that, I know that, you love us all as your students as well. So thank you for that love. Thank you for passing it on. And I look forward to keeping the conversation going.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good night. We'll talk soon.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for tuning in to this inspired conversation, where I interviewed a change maker in higher education. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and rate the podcast. If you do, you'll get an update once a new powerful story is posted. And more importantly, you'll help spread the word about some of the advice and tips we've given to students. For a list of resources shared in today's episode, read the description attached. One of my favorite things about this interactive podcast is that it's recorded live. So if you have questions for our guest presenters, you can tune in as well. For a list of upcoming live podcasts, follow Inspired Conversations Pod on Instagram and click the link in my bio. If you are tuning in today and have questions about college applications, college success, or financial aid, email me at counselorcova@gmail.com. Again, that's counselorcova@gmail.com. Know that you're not alone. I've been a college access and success counselor for many years, and I got your back. Remember, your success is your community's success, and you got this. I'll see you next time.